I heard about James kind of on the circuit. He's certainly a name and a presence for a long time, but I think, like many people, even people who pay a great deal of attention to poetry, what I had seen in anthologies and books didn't particularly strike me, and I did not connect to it or to him. It struck me as being sort of lightweight, almost light verse, and I thought, what is the big deal here? I don't understand why people get excited about this. And then one day I was in San Francisco. I'm going to say it might have been in the late 80s, and I went into a used bookstore when there were used bookstores, and I bought a copy of Ecstasies completely on a whim, or you can say that something was maybe perhaps directing me to buy that. And I thought, maybe, you know what, I'm going to give the old boy a chance. So I took it back over to the cafe floor, and I sat down with a cup of coffee and I started to read it. The first thing that really reached out and smacked me was the image of the do not disturb sign at Beck's Motel not being changed for 3 days. And, a lot of poets would tell you what happened in that room with that one line. He doesn't really need to tell you anything. You know what happened. So I made my way through the book, and I thought, I've obviously been missing out on something and someone who is important. And not too long after that, I wrote him a fan letter, and actually I think a postcard, and he sent me back a letter, and we began to correspond. This would have been around, I'm going to say maybe 1991 or 92. Thrilling, actually, because as much as James was about fun, James took people seriously, and his correspondence was never in any way patronizing. It was never an exalted presence, sort of looking down on an admirer or anything like that. He was always egalitarian in his tone, and he was enthusiastic about sharing ideas. He would send drafts of new poems and ask for comments. I think there was an element of flattery in there, but that he wouldn't have been averse to. But the correspondence quickened, and then at one point I proposed to him that since I was going to be in Port Townsend or near there, I should come out and do an interview with him for a magazine called American Writing. So I went out to visit he and Joel at their place in Port Townsend, and we sat down for about 4 hours and did that interview, which was, I remember thinking, just an amazing to be in the presence of this mind for 4 hours and hearing him hold forth on the various subjects. Because it wasn't just that he had a first-rate mind, which he did, and it wasn't somebody that wore it on his sleeve, but he did. But he was also a highly original kind of intelligence. Quick, improvisational, with vast resources behind every sentence. What was the San Francisco Renaissance? Well, James might say that it was invented by Kenneth Rexroth, and he would probably be correct in that, Kenneth Rexroth was an older presence in San Francisco, connected to some of the modernist currents in poetry. He was a figure that a lot of the young up-and-coming poets out of Berkeley, like Robin Blazer and Jack Spicer and Robert Duncan, coalesced around. James was a friend of his, and these people began to put together a scene. Of course, there was also, at the same time, a movement in painting that focused on figurative art with people like Richard Diebenkorn that was happening at the same time. So there was this parallel movement in the arts that was happening in San Francisco that was also going on in New York City, but Kenneth Rexroth was determined to draw a lot of attention to that. The people who became the leading lights of the movement in time were Robert Duncan, who was a strategist, much more than James, and is a great writer and a great poet. So Duncan got a lot of the laurels, and Spicer maybe posthumously because he died at the age of 40, and more people read him and more young people pay attention to him. James, I think, as part of that whole movement, knew those people, connected to them, was influenced by them, and did influence them until Duncan kind of double-crossed him in an article in Poetry that brought their friendship to a standstill for quite a while. Maybe he thought James was getting a little bit too much attention, but James kind of staked out his own terrain in that he is not like any of them. The voice is different. He set out to take light verse and infuse it with a kind of Jungian content and allusions that would normally be brought up in deep therapy emerge in these nursery rhyme-like poems in a completely startling and offbeat way, and it was unlike anything anybody there was doing or anybody else anywhere was doing. I would love to. In the sanitarium. How did I arrive in this chill and gutted museum? The guide provided by the agency had skipped at the first frontier. Gadgets, pellets, the extra wool wadding made no difference. Chronic and toxic continued to prove mortal. Having presented in detail the nature of my case, I was interrupted. He said, bluntly, "It is not worth more than $1 an hour." Treatment of the shock. What to shut off, which draft the most deadly. The smaller the night hours, the larger the scissors. Is all of man's life a convalescence? To spend one more night here is unbearable. Yes, said the nurse, but imperative. And that's from 1946. A lot of what James writes about, a formative experience, was a kind of midlife crisis that he underwent, really kind of an identity problem. James wanted to be someone, but he was being pulled in the other direction. I would suspect a kind of nervous breakdown. And he went into therapy, he went into Jungian therapy, and a lot of the poems are about him coming to terms with his essentially androgynous self, acknowledging the self, and going forward from that point, confirmed in his identity as a result of the therapy experience. I think a lot of those darker poems are about those doubts that he had. There are a lot of poems from the period of the 40s and into the early 50s, which are grouped together in Packing Up for Paradise, a section called Moribundia, Land of Death. And I think that James at the time, and he doesn't really talk about this that much in his autobiography, probably because he had explored it in the poetry, was having an identity crisis. He didn't know who he was or had necessarily figured out what he wanted to be. He needed to acknowledge this androgynous side of his self, this man-loving or homoerotic side of himself. He hadn't yet come to terms with it, or he had abandoned it. He had gotten married. He had moved toward a conventional kind of life. He was in crisis. Basically, he was thrown into crisis. And these darker poems are about, like Feathers and Lead, in the sanitarium, talking about his fears of being shut up in a madhouse and the therapy he was undergoing at the time. The great thing about the poems, when he talks about them, images like cables of starch, really things that nobody else could come up with. He takes you there and shows you how dire, you feel how dire the state that he was in was, without him ever really describing anything that's actually literally happening. The San Francisco Renaissance, I think there's lots of definitions of it. Everyone would like to own it. Some people deny that it ever happened. So it's one of those topics that is always up for grabs. But in essence, what you can say about it is that there was a preeminent figure, of being Kenneth Rexroth, around whom the younger, newer generation of poets who had come to the city of San Francisco began to coalesce. There were poets like Jack Spicer and Robert Duncan, Robin Blazer, who were attending Berkeley, who were in the thrall of the big modernist heavies like William Carlos Williams and Ezra Pound. And James Broughton was a part of that movement. He knew those people, Robert Duncan. He was part of Jack Spicer's famous poetry workshop, Poetry Magic workshop. And at the same time that you had this writing going on, you had a movement of painters, people like Richard Diebenkorn, who were doing representational painting of a completely different type. So while there was a lot of attention directed to what was going on in New York City, there was this parallel movement happening in San Francisco. And then suddenly the Beats arrived, and some of the Black Mountain people arrived when Black Mountain closed at the end of the 50s. So then things got really wild around 1956 when you had the very famous reading of Allen Ginsberg reading it. I think it's called Gallery 6. And I don't remember the other people. I think maybe Philip Whalen was one of the readers, but of course it's probably the most famous poetry reading in American poetry of the 20th century. So all of this kind of grew out of what was happening in San Francisco in the late 40s, and it built and built and built and built, and James was always in the center of it. After the war, a lot of people went to San Francisco, and you began to see a movement in San Francisco, a literary movement that was, in some respects, parallel to what was happening in other places like New York and Black Mountain, where writers who were under the influence of the major modernist thinkers and writers like Pound and William Carlos Williams, a new generation of writers who took those figures and their work as a starting point and advanced from that direction. And the intermediate figure here is Kenneth Rexroth, and James would say that in some respects the San Francisco Renaissance with Kenneth Rexroth's creation. And Kenneth Rexroth was good at self-promotion, but the fact of the matter is that many writers came there. People like Gary Snyder and Philip Whalen came there from Reed College in Oregon, where they had all been enthralled by a reading that William Carlos Williams did. People like Michael McClure and refugees from Black Mountain College like John Wieners were showing up in San Francisco. So you had this movement beginning in the late 40s and certainly continuing into the 50s, when suddenly the Beats, with the publication of On the Road and Howl in 56 and 57, suddenly you've got this whole galaxy alighting on San Francisco, and now it's in full throttle. And not just some kind of provincial counterpart to what's happening in New York City, but its own force and movement, and with figures who are, you could argue, outshadow some of the people in New York. Somebody like William Everson, really, maybe the greatest writer about nature poet about nature that has ever come out of American poetry. And people like Jack Spicer and Robert Duncan taking the work of H.D. and Williams and advancing it. So San Francisco became a literary center. A writer can either write in isolation, which doesn't work often, or he can function as part of a group, a milieu, a circle, where like-minded souls fertilize each other and each other's activities. That's what was happening in San Francisco. And James looked at what other people were doing and went with the things that enthralled and amused him, such as nursery rhymes and Jungian psychology, and built out of it his own original take on that kind of post-Pound, post-Williams literary movement. That's where really he comes from. You have to figure there have always been people who write rhymed verse. Well, there are people now who write rhyme verse and publish rhyme verse, and there's not necessarily something or anything wrong with rhyme verse. It's just that it can be predictable and really, to use a term that was common at the time, square. So nobody did it. And if you looked at people like Gary Snyder and people that James knew, and certainly Philip Whalen, I mean, nobody was, they might toss an internal rhyme in there as like, but they weren't thinking about end-rhymed lines of poems, or certainly that organized into couplets or quatrains. That was just also way back there. So James thought, why not? I'm sure this is what he was thinking. Why not? And why not take those forms and that sound and put into it the kinds of images that nobody would expect? And by virtue of the contrast, and because he's all about opposites, you've got this really, really conventional form and sound, and this really kooky, dark, but wild and witty content and voice. So you merge those two things, and you've got something that nobody else is doing, and something that really nobody did that before him, and nobody could ever do it after him. Because if you tried to do it now, people would say, "Oh, it's like somebody once came into a gallery where there were paintings and said, who did the Diebenkorn?" It'd be the same thing. Who did the Broughton? It's that him. Well, James had an expression that he liked to say from time to time. You're either a songbird or you're not. Oh, and is that ever true? And because many are called but few are chosen, a lot of people would like to write poetry. And they may have things to say, may even have a voice buried back there. But there's a lot of work that comes with paring those lines down to the point where every sound is exactly right. And you don't, because if there's anything in there that isn't right, you end up with a clunker. James worked and reworked those poems. I remember looking at some of the drafts of the different Big Joy poems. He was a meticulous craftsman with lots of tools in the box that he could, and that's why he could write so many different kinds of poems. He could write an I remember kind of catalog poem, and then he could turn around and write something that was sort of an effusive oral gyration. There was, it was having that technical facility at his disposal allowed him enormous range. Well, here's the thing. A poem should look like and sound like a thought that entered your head and moved from point A to point D to point G to point H, and then down to R and Z, and then that was it. So the poem retraces the movement of the thought through the brain and the thought process, but it's an illusion because it never really maybe once in 5 years it actually happens like that, where something is channeled right through your thinking and comes out onto the page. In effect, what you're creating is an illusion that the thought happened this way. And so in order to create this illusion, just like a painting, you were going to have to work and work and work and work to make something sound natural, which is not really natural at all. It didn't come into the world unbidden. It had to be created. I do believe that he is a great poet. I think there's a horse race that goes on in poetry. There's who's on top and who's number two, and who's come. who's coming up last and who do we bet on now and how much. And to some extent, that runs counter to the authentic poetic voice. It's bringing the commercial mindset into the world of art, and he rejected it. So to say James is a major poet or James is a minor poet, and what are you if you're a minor poet? A dust mote. I don't think it's necessarily up to me or anyone to say James Broughton is a great poet. My view, my goal was to take his work and put it into a book that would show people that this was a great poet. And that this, and really, what does that mean? For me, there's a practical aspect to it, and that is this. It's the book that stays on the shelf and that you go back to. Because there's always something more to be learned, and because the writing stays new. You know, just like, you know, here's a poet that writes about love. What's the great thing about love? When does love begin to die? When it's not new anymore. How do you keep love new? Well, that's the big struggle, you know. And that's what the aspect that his work contains, is that it remains new. It remains invigorating. You don't read it once and forget it. You go back and you reread it. To me, that signals greatness. That delineates, that defines a great poet. What is his legacy? Really, what do we mean by that? But how will he be remembered? And for how long will he be remembered? Because that's worth considering. I think one of the aspects of James that is a little bit unusual is the fact that he became involved with radical fairies and gay rights because he was a forthright poet of homoerotic love at a time when there weren't many people writing about this, and the people that were writing about it were, in essence, well, they didn't say it anywhere near as well as James did, because here was a master writing about it, and writing about it beautifully and movingly. So I think there's this kind of political following that James had in his own life. People would come and hear him read because of what he was writing about. There's that. There's also the other element of his legacy, which is that he is one of the most important poets in a hugely significant movement of American poetry. His is a voice which remains contemporary. Let's say you read one of the Chinese masters from the 16th or 17th century, and it's like, that poem was written yesterday. How did that happen? Well, that's a mystery. And it's not easily attained. That element or aspect, I think, is present in a great deal of James Broughton's work, and it guarantees that that work will remain important and enduring. On a sort of a final part of it is that poetry has its ups and downs in American life. I mean, if you went back to the 60s, you'd see, Allen Ginsberg would do a reading and thousands of people would show up, in Nebraska, tens of thousands of people in the stadium to hear, in 1967, hearing Allen Ginsberg. Carl Riccozzi published his first book in 30 years, and thousands, everybody's out there buying copies, Young people in America wanted poetry, and they needed poetry. And then that all kind of, went away for a while. My sense is that it's back, and there's a lot of young people who are looking for what is in poems and what Williams says people die for lack of. And a lot of those people that are looking for great poets are going to find this one, and that's why he will remain alive for us. This is it. this is it, and I am it, and you are it, and so is that, and he is it, and she is it, and it is it, and that is that. Oh, it is this, and it is thus, and it is them, and it is us, and it is now, and here it is, and here we are, and this is it. I would say it was, for me, the experience was like being with the father that you or I wished had been, without necessarily disowning my parent. Here was a guy, now what would he be, 97? So he's like 40 years older than me. So really could have been my father. I mean, his son is around my age. And yet, not wielding authority or, but friendly, open, generous, not someone who suffered fools gladly, but you sort of understood that from the beginning, not that he would be temperamental or unpleasant, it's just that he was like a holy man in the sense that when he describes himself as a small town swami. And I would say that if my sense of being in a spiritual presence was awakened by being with him, and I would define that in this way, that he could tell me that he had a room in his house for worshiping Mother Mira, whom I had never heard of, and whom he would know from our correspondence would be just completely off the wall to me. And anything that he said, no matter how completely outside the scope of my thinking or activity it was, I was prepared to take seriously because of who he was. And he made you feel that way, that you were among equals, and he would take whatever you thought seriously, and you would take whatever he thought with seriousness. And I remember when we were walking through Port Townsend, and he was already in his 80s, and we were coming down the street. James was wearing a little caftan and some kind of, robe. And as we were walking by, I noticed his eyes dart toward a window. And I thought, he's cruising someone. And I looked in the window, and there's this guy about 18 years old. And I thought, my God, he's outrageous. It wasn't a show. I mean, James was cruising this 18-year-old kid, which I thought was kind of funny. Yeah. You take a poem like Round Table, and you start with a line. It's all in your head, the first man said. And it sounds like a nursery rhyme. And it has a very conventional kind of sound, the way it, the accents are placed. But you know from the line, 6 words, that this is going somewhere really different. And that's, I think, when people, that's the originality, that's the invention. And if you believe that originality is genius, and that may be what it is, then that's the genius, is that you can take you can play off of people's expectations for what kind of message is going to be delivered here by what they're accustomed to hearing in this kind of rhythm, and then slam them upside the head with something completely different that makes them think and makes them consider the world in a new way. Because really, that poetry has to do that. It has to make you see the world differently than you do. That's probably what Williams was talking about when he said people die every day for lack of what is found there. That voice. Well, I mean, let me start out by kind of describing it, because when you hear it, it makes total sense. The lines make sense. You can see, you can feel. And there's something a little creepy in it. There's something a little sinister in it. It's difficult to define, because when you're talking about a voice in poetry, it's somebody who, I guess the best way to say this is, someone has figured out a way to take his or her personality and transfer it intact onto the page. This is the real, authentic human being here, speaking away and apart from artifice and convention, one to another, and it's real. We're socialized to blend in. But to be a poet, you have to take yourself out of the mix and be who you really are. That's a tall order. People try and try and try. And if they don't succeed, it's not necessarily for artistic reasons. Could be for many others. So when you read the voice, when you read the poems on the page and the lines, and you hear that voice, Papa had a pig, and a big pig too. Boom. Who else could be saying that? Does that make sense? I think that he, to some extent, his failure to find a big public, and really, what is a big public for a poet in America? I mean, you could have somebody like Allen Ginsberg or Adrienne Rich, will get a lot of people to come to an auditorium and hear them, but it's not, certainly, it's not the Philadelphia Eagles. So he didn't have even anything like what Allen Ginsberg would have in terms of a public and an audience and a following. There began to be that, I think, and certainly he was well known in San Francisco and a big fish in the pond there. But he did not, and I remember him talking about this in an interview we did. He said, I'm not making products. And for him, products were things that were manufactured and artificial and stale. What he remained true to the vision that he had and the kind of writing he had created. And he just hoped that somebody would get it and begin to pay attention. And he accepted the fact that he was going to die. He came to terms with that, and he did it in the poems. And he probably understood, and I'm sure hoped, that they would get it when he wasn't physically, literally here, which I think they are. The San Francisco Renaissance, I think there's lots of definitions of it. Everyone would like to own it. Some people deny that it ever happened. So it's one of those topics that is always up for grabs. But in essence, what you can say about it is that there was a preeminent figure, of being Kenneth Rexroth, around whom the younger, newer generation of poets who had come to the city of San Francisco began to coalesce. There were poets like Jack Spicer and Robert Duncan, Robin Blazer, who were attending Berkeley, who were in the thrall of the big modernist heavies like William Carlos Williams and Ezra Pound. And James Broughton was a part of that movement. He knew those people, Robert Duncan. He was part of Jack Spicer's famous poetry workshop, Poetry Magic workshop. And at the same time that you had this writing going on, you had a movement of painters, people like Richard Diebenkorn, who were doing representational painting of a completely different type. So while there was a lot of attention directed to what was going on in New York City, there was this parallel movement happening in San Francisco. People, and then suddenly the Beats arrived, and some of the Black Mountain people arrived when Black Mountain closed at the end of the 50s. So then things got really wild around 1956 when you had the very famous reading of Allen Ginsberg reading it. I think it's called Gallery 6. And I don't remember the other people. I think maybe Philip Whalen was one of the readers, but of course it's probably the most famous poetry reading in American poetry of the 20th century. So all of this kind of grew out of what was happening in San Francisco in the late 40s, and it built and built and built and built, and James was always in the center of it. In 1960, Donald Allen edited and published a book called The New American Poetry, which grouped all these different avant-garde schools into one anthology and made the case for avant-garde, post-war avant-garde American poetry as one of the most significant currents in American culture. The New American Poetry made an audacious claim, and the claim was this, that there were three products of American culture that were interesting to people abroad, i.e., therefore not provincial in their essence, and those were abstract expressionism, jazz, and the post-war poetry of the various schools that were gathered together in the New American Poetry, and those would include the poets of the San Francisco Renaissance, the deep image poets, the beat poets, the New York School poets, and the poets that came out of Black Mountain College and the people that taught there and went to school there. So this anthology came out in 1960, and in essence what happened was this book grouped and ranked the avant-garde. It threw down the gauntlet, and people took sides. You were kind of for it or against it. Now, James was included in it, and I remember him one time complaining that he was only included in there. He's included with a single poem. It is one of his greatest poems, Feathers Are Lead. Here we are 50 years later. Perhaps Donald Allen would have been better served by giving James a few more pages in the New American Poetry. It is an anthology that people continue to have on their shelves, and that young people interested in poetry continue to read, which when you think about this is a half century later, and it's like prairie school architecture. You look at a house that was built in 1911 and it looks like it was designed yesterday. The same thing, you could say the same thing about the poems in that anthology. They're that current. They're that fresh. They stay new. He was a friend of a number of the people who were in that movement or around the movement. James's relationship to the beat movement, no, I don't think anybody would say that James was a beat poet. He was a friend of Allen Ginsberg and Gary Snyder and Michael McClure. He has a poem that's dedicated to William Everson, who was sort of incorporated into that movement, although he's kind of off on his own, doing his own thing as a very great nature poet. But I think that James would have rejected the notion of himself as being a part of any school or any movement. One of the things that struck me when I went to his house, I expected to see walls and walls of books of poems by all these contemporaries and other modern masters or even ancient masters. And I noticed that there was really only one bookcase and that there were almost no poets in the bookcase. And I thought about that later, and I thought, now why wouldn't he at least be keeping score? Why wouldn't he be following what other people are writing? And I believe, when I thought about it, I came to the conclusion that James, not that he wasn't interested in what other poets were writing, he didn't take it seriously or pay attention to it. It's that he was really literally doing his thing. When I knew him, he was in his late 70s and probably writing with the understanding that he didn't have that much time left. He produced a lot of first-rate work in his last 10 years, and he wasn't interested in being distracted by gratuitous information. I should say it was a collective decision. We had a group in Philadelphia called Insight to Riot. This was a poets collective. We published each other. Whenever we came up with a manuscript that we thought was good, then we would collectively get together and all of us would edit it, and we would share the tasks and put it together. And James mentioned that he was working on a manuscript called Little Sermons of the Big Joy. He sent me some of the poems. I showed them to other people in the group. Everybody was very excited at the prospect of publishing James Broughton. I think by that time, everybody in our group had been turned on to James, and we were thrilled to have published that little book. Now, it was difficult to be involved without there being some disputes. And in this case, James was very interested in knowing what the cover of this book was going to look like. And I thought, I already knew from experience that you don't show the poet the cover because then the poet is going to want to change the cover. I mean, remember one time we published this great book by Alexandra Grillikes. She looked at the cover art and she demanded that her nose be removed. Somebody had turned her face into a collage, and the nose was either too big or in the wrong place, and she wanted the nose out of the collage, and eventually it was, and the tears were shed. So I said to James, no, really, let's let that be a surprise. You like surprises? And he said, oh, yes. I said, well, then let's let that be a surprise. And it was. And so we took the photograph of him when he was, 3 or 4, in his sailor suit, sitting on a porch, and somebody colored it and stuck him out in the middle of eternity with stars around him, and that became the image, and he was delighted. And he was also delighted with our color choices of yellow and purple, great colors for James Broughton, and the typeface, which I think is a dingbat typeface, also appropriate. His poetry, here's the thing about it, and it took me a long time to come to this conclusion, sort of think it through. Thousands of people are out there writing poems in America and publishing their poems more than ever on the internet, and in print. So let's say that you came along and you plucked the byline off of that poem. How would you know who it belonged to? How would you know what mind it came out of? The answer is that you wouldn't. Because there is not enough in that text to distinguish it from any other text. Whereas if you hear 4 or 5 consecutive notes by Mozart or Prokofiev, you know instantly who you're hearing. So how does that happen? Now, the thing about James Broughton is if you read a line of James Broughton, you know that it's James Broughton. So James is off kind of in his own corner, doing things with paradox and to some extent with rhetoric that nobody else was doing or thought to do. he continued to deepen that through his career. It's not one of these careers that starts out strong and peters out after 3 books. It's one that goes from the 40s literally till the time he was probably, working on correcting something, but, on his deathbed, I wouldn't doubt it. But the poetry is mischievous because it presents itself, it's faux naive. It presents itself as something almost childlike. And then it slams you with images that are of a highly original kind of sophistication, like the cables of starch. What the hell? Now, when you think cables of starch, that doesn't make any sense, but when you visualize it, then you can see it, and it's a dry, terrible place that's conjured up by that image. And he could create images like that consistently. And he was also a master of wordplay. So that the poems had a kind of rhythmic quality that you might find in Victorian light verse, but they are not light verse at all. In effect, they're the opposite of light verse. Although they can be light, they can also be dark, and that's his philosophy. So it's, as he said, it's not either or, it's both and. Oh, yeah, okay. The poem is called Round Table. It's all in your head, the first man said. It's all in your heart, said another. It's all in your stars, said the man with scars. It's all in your guts, said his brother. It's all in your soul, said the man who was slow. It's all in your balls, said the fast one. It's all in your things, said the fellow with rings. It's no thing at all, said the last one. Why didn't he become more well-known? He certainly deserved to be, and he felt he deserved to be. But there are talented people who think that the talent and accomplishment means the world will arrive at their door knocking, and there'll be a phalanx of cameras behind them. If that were the case, it would be a better world, but it's not the case. And so James, I think, waited for the level of attention and respect that really his work earned and was due, and it did not arrive. Now the question is, why didn't it arrive? And he has a line in one of his poems about the literal-minded literati, which he was tweaking them. He was not a literal-minded kind of writer, and he was for the thinking person. But he was not, if you take somebody like Duncan, his contemporary, Duncan was out there doing all the things that you need to do to get attention and get a big reputation. James declined to do those kinds of things. And I believe that he felt confident that the work would carry itself. Even when he wrote his stunning memoir, which moves at a gallop. It's like a sea biscuit. And you can read it in an afternoon, and it will take you on an emotional ride up and down. We're talking about the death of his father, and what a true and controlling person his mother was, and the fact that he was the boyfriend of Hart Crane's boyfriend, which is still really strange to think about. That book came out, and the response was silence. Silence. It got reviewed somewhere, I think Publishers Weekly or something. James was talking about it. The review was completely without the slightest level of understanding of what the book was about or why it could possibly be significant. The thing about someone like Broughton, James Broughton, is that he is an original. And original doesn't mean that you're creating something out of total thin air. It means that you have taken all the things that have come into your experience, and you have transformed it into a unique, he would never use the word product, creation. And he was an original in the sense that there's nobody like him. When you hear the voice, it could only be James. That should have entitled him to a great deal of respect and admiration. But unfortunately, he didn't get even a fraction of what he should have gotten, I think. But he was not going to be... There is a quote in that he leads off with Emerson in Ecstasies, where he talks about, and Emerson is blowing off what he calls the geography of fame, dismissing it. And that would be very Emersonian, not to pay attention to fame, to dismiss its power. And James, if there's one writer really that James stands on the shoulders of one writer in particular, it would be Emerson. And I think that part of the Emersonian philosophy was, you don't go out there and wave the flag. You don't pound your breasts. That wasn't him. He wasn't prepared to do that. Who dismissed him and why? I can't cite chapter and verse. When you would bring his name up, see, there was another person that came out of San Francisco, also part of the Renaissance, who had a spectacular career and then crashed, named Richard Brautigan. People still read him, and they should read him because he was extremely brilliant and very dark. And as James once mentioned, that Brautigan and Broughton are, placed on the shelves beside each other. That it wasn't really a coincidence or an accident. And somebody like Brautigan, who got a lot more attention than James ever did because his books sold millions of copies and he was kind of a protege of Jack Spicer. Trout Fishing in America sold 2 million copies. Could that even happen in America today? That's, you're talking about a serious postmodern book, that's... And what would happen is that people would review Richard Brautigan, and they would say, this is unserious, whimsical, hippy-dippy, West Coast, non-serious writing. And when you brought, and that's it, and I think in a way that kind of killed Richard Brautigan, because he thought, no matter how much money I have, these people are going to come after me again and again and again and say this. And they were saying it because they just didn't get it. And I think with James Broughton, when you brought up the subject of James Broughton to people who were familiar with poetry, but maybe not James Broughton, who knew who he was, had maybe read some things, they basically used the same argument. It's whimsical, it's hippy-dippy, it's new age, and therefore we don't really have to take it seriously. When the autobiography came out, when the memoir came out, Coming Unbuttoned, James was convinced that it would make his reputation. He was fairly certain. And then he saw that first review, and he got just knocked right off his perch because he was dismissed. So I think, in putting together Packing Up for Paradise, I had a motive. And the motive was that people who might think that this was a writer that they knew enough about to brush off needed to look at these poems in this order, and if they did, and when they did, they would understand right away that they were wrong. Not many people find true love at 62. Okay? That is a rare gem. What did he do to make that happen, or to earn it, or both? So maybe that sojourn in Moribundia was worth the trip. Because, boom. He met Joel when he was 62. They were together for 23 years. Joel was his boon companion, and gave him many happy years. Took care of him, helped his career. I mean, maybe that's one of the reasons why the career never got farther than it did, was because there wasn't somebody like Joel saying, you've got to do this, you've got to apply for this, you need to do this. There needed to be somebody in the background who was urging him on. And he certainly wrote some stunning love poems to and for Joel. So that's something worth considering. Where did it come from? James, in our correspondence, mentioned to me that he would like to see his collected poems be published. But he wasn't sure who would publish it, what it would be called, what kind of form it would take, or whatever. Did I have any ideas or suggestions? I'm trying to think of how it came about that we were connected to John Martin at Black Sparrow in Santa Rosa, California. John Martin and Black Sparrow published about 700 books in its history. Most of the best voices in the avant-garde. And John Martin didn't have to think twice or be persuaded to publish James Broughton in a big book. I mean, it was an immediate given and an immediate yes. And the only question was, what should be the title of the book, and what should be in it, and what should be the form and organization of the book. Now, originally James wanted to do a collected poems, which includes everything that has been in print in book form, typically, sometimes periodical publication, but Black Sparrow couldn't afford to do that. And so Packing Up for Paradise became a selected poems. Now the question then became, should it be chronological, which is a typical convention in arranging the selected poems, or should it be thematic? And we kind of went back and forth on that. My suggestion was that it should be thematic. And in winning James over to that argument, I pointed out to him that Emerson would certainly have thought that it should be thematic, that he was opposed to the conventions of chronology. So that did it. And we also talked about a title. We began I flew out to Port Townsend and spent days with James working on the book in his little office that he paid $100 a month for in this wonderful old building. And we had some disputes and disagreements about what should go into it. I think that that's typical of editor and poet. And to be candid about it, I felt that the poems that he often read at readings, like Shaman Psalm, that went over really well at readings, went over well because they were rhetorical and political and of their moment. And I said to him, and he did not disagree with me, this will probably be your last book, and you need to think carefully about what you want to be remembered by. But I also felt that there should be nothing in this book which would give anyone the opportunity, because this is how people that don't like a writer will operate, that would give anybody the opportunity to fix on one particular poem or several and say, this is of no substance, this is lightweight. I wanted the book to make the case that this is an important and enduring poet. That was my goal. And naturally, so we weren't going to agree on everything, and we didn't. What was it like to work with him? Probably many people would say to you that, and you may know from your own experience, that there was a certain presence there. He once described himself very accurately as a small-town Swami. And that, I think, gets it right. It was a pleasure to be in the presence of that mind and that generous and all-embracing temperament. There were moments, and some tense moments, when we locked horns about what would go in the book. And the reason being that, and this is not peculiar to James Broughton, poets don't always know what their best work is. A poet's work and his reputation and the attention that he gets and his or her vanity are all inextricably linked. It is impossible for the poet to sort those things out and come to a completely wholly objective and correct approach, I think. You need another set of eyes and you need another mind to say, this works, this is right, this doesn't quite make it. And James was attached to some of those poems as if they were his offspring. And, you know, for an artist, your creations are your offspring. So I understand that. But there were one particular afternoon when things got really tense in that office. But we were able to resolve those difficulties and come up with a book that I think we both agreed on. You know, well, not surprisingly, there was no front page review in the New York Times book review section. To the best of my knowledge, the New York Review of Books never even paid the slightest bit of attention. In other words, Packing Up for Paradise was pretty much ignored by the critical establishment. On the other hand, people who didn't know James Broughton, but who were interested in poetry, began to put it on their shelves and make it a permanent part of their shelves. And that, I think, was the aim. You know, if all of a sudden the critics all said, wow, look what we've been missing, how are they going to do that? How are they going to do that? I mean, they might have done that if he was 95, you know, and in his in the nursing home, like a poem, News from the Nursing Home. That would have been the news. But that didn't happen. But I think a lot of people started to pass the book around and read it, and I think it will sustain his reputation. Well, you're talking about a guy that wrote a book, about like taking a dump in the woods. To him, I think what was weird were people who were conventional minded. I don't know if anything was really weird to him. If it was weird, then he had to go there and find out about it. I mean, he has a whole book where he's having a conversation with the ocean. Is that weird? When you read it, it doesn't seem weird. And that's an artistic accomplishment. I think, when you say weird, I mean, is weird strange? And what's strange is often beautiful. I mean, I would go with the word strange. And James was always strange, and he liked the strange. And there's that slang word strange, which is somebody that you've never had sex with. You've had, that's supposed to be the best. And that was what he gravitated toward. Whatever was strange. I mean, look, you have to have certain skills to talk about and describe having a bowel movement in the woods. There are whole pages in the Androgyne Journal about that. It doesn't make you fling down the book in disgust. You just think, wow, I've never really thought about this. You'd have to be a really good writer to do that. How have I been affected by him? I think, if you are a poet and you're reading a master, and this is a master, then you don't want to be a little master. You got to avoid that. There are a lot of little masters out there. But there are things to take away that you can use that you hope to slip in your pocket without anybody seeing. And I would say in this case, one of the most astonishing things that he did that very few people really went to is his use of paradox, where he would combine opposites inside the same line and just roll with it and come up with an image that managed to put them both into the same logical framework. Two things that had no business being together were there, and they seemed like they absolutely should have been all along. Nobody could really do that. Nobody fixed on paradox like James Broughton. And it was one of Oscar Wilde's signatures, was paradox. I think James also showed that you can range widely over different types of poems, because he wrote all kinds of poems. He wrote occasional poems, and he wrote verse plays, and he wrote catalog poems, and there really wasn't any form that he wasn't willing to go to. But you knew when you read a line of it that it was his. The form wasn't unique. Subject matter wasn't necessarily unique. Anybody could go to the ocean and talk to it and report on that. But the tone, and more importantly, what comes through the tone and that we understand almost unconsciously is that this tone, this voice, is the product of a lifetime's experience. All kinds of things have happened to let the person say this in this way. And I think that's something to take away from him. You realize that if you're really being yourself, and this is a guy that went to a lot of therapists, and that's probably the first thing a therapist would tell you is just be yourself. And James was just himself. If you're being yourself, then that voice will be there. And you can take on any subject. Content doesn't matter. Form doesn't matter. What matters is the speaking voice and thought in action. Because that's really what engages the other mind, the mind on the other side of the page. Well, he said that Here is a paradox, right? You can look at life as a playground, or you can look at life as a prison. Take your choice. There's your choice. Is it a prison? Oh God, this is wrong and that's wrong, and sort of be a Dorothy Parker about it. She managed to make something out of it. But you can see life as a prison, or you can see it as a place where you can explore adventure, not predicament. And as he said, it's not an either or, it's a both and. You're going to be in both places at different times. You've got to come to grips with that. Here's James in his crib, and bing, into the room comes this Peter Pan-like thing that announces its name is Hermie, and it has told him that his vocation is to be a poet. And don't ever let anybody tell you that you're not that. Don't let other people laugh at you. You need to do this and be this. And, anytime he ever tells people this, they think he's cuckoo. His mother he said his mother didn't believe in, how did he put extraterrestrial mysteries? I can only imagine what she would have said when he told her about that. But one of the things that this Hermie told him was that his life should really be devoted to promoting, propagating big joy. And what is big joy? Well, I think James could probably provide you with about 83 definitions, depending on what time of day it was. But my sense of it is that there is, you can look at life as a prison or a playground, and if you choose to look at it as a playground, there are a lot of things out there that will make you like yourself, feel whole, experience gladness, know pleasure, all of those things. Those don't need to be relegated to some small corner of your life. They can be at its center. It's big and it's joyful. And it's there. It's there if you find it, and it's there if you make it and create it and be it. And James wasn't all of that all the time, as who could be. Even Walt Whitman wasn't all of that all the time. But it was the most important part of who he was. It was what he was looking for and what he was meant to be, as Hermie told him. So I think, he when he wrote those poems about big joy, in essence, they're discussions of optimism. They are messages about optimism, being true to yourself, not being stuck in, as he put it, a well-upholstered rut. And he had been in a well-upholstered rut in the waning days of his marriage. And suddenly Joel came along. Boom, it's a whole new life. I mean, who falls in love at 62, madly, passionately in love? They're on their way to Ceylon. They're wading into the Ganges River together. This guy who's 62 and somebody who was 26. That's a great story. I think he must have done something to earn it, because it doesn't just happen to anybody. James thought about it a lot, and he thought about it early. What did James think about death? And how did he address it in his poetry? James, like all poets, I think, stakes out certain subjects where he is preeminent in his eloquence. And one of them is love. One of them is childhood and its mysteries and joys. And Certainly one of them is death, because he thought about it a lot, about mortality, and he set out to describe his body changing and failing and what he would think, what it would be like not to be here. I don't think that I haven't read many better poems and I think that they're really good because they're totally fearless. He's talking about incontinence. Yeah. Who's going to write a poem about their own incontinence? The same person that would be out in the woods describing them. Every year he wrote a poem on his birthday. And that continued right up to the age of 85. The poems never wavered and the voice never waffled. He knew what he was dealing with. He knew his days were numbered. And he said in those poems that he wanted to enjoy, he was glad that he had enjoyed life as much as he had. He was also glad to be leaving when he was, that there were things that he was taking with him that were gone forever when he was gone. But on the whole, it wasn't a bad thing. And in that respect, the only person that I can think of in American poetry who approached that in the same way is Whitman. In the Song of Myself, where he talks about, in I think this seventh section, looking at the leaves of grass and imagining that if these were young men, if I had known them, I would have loved them. The whole cycle of things coming into being and passing into another phase, he talked about how that applied to himself. So he understood it wasn't just a catalog of decrepitude. I think a lot of people would have just reported it. Oh my God, I need a facelift. That wasn't the way James approached it. He saw it in a secular way. The funny thing of talking about Packing Up for Paradise is that, James didn't have a title for the collection, didn't know what he wanted to. And he said, I said, this Packing Up for Paradise, that this would be a great title. And he said, oh no, it sounds like I'm on a honeymoon in Hawaii. And I said, well, really, you've been packing up for paradise your whole life. And he thought about it. He agreed with that. So we went with Packing Up for Paradise. Packing up for paradise, I shall take me along no shoulds or mustn'ts or oughtas. I shall go pretty much as I've come, long-windy and snail-footed. I won't be cooking up some perfection that can't be counted on. I will carry my aberrations with me under personal effects. Settling into paradise, I will keep growing down and outward as much as up and at 'em. I will try to be true to my natural undoing as of, before, and always. I won't expect a tomorrow vastly niftier than today. I intend to just body sit around and bask in my universal mind. James Broughton was a harpsichord with a brain. James Broughton was a renegade police car. James Broughton was a beautiful and important personality. James Broughton was a milkshake never again tasted.